On the night of October 14th, 1912, a man walks onto a stage in Milwaukee with a bullet in his chest, not a graze, not a near miss, a .38 caliber round fired from 6 feet away that has punched through a folded 50-page speech, through a steel eyeglass case, through his overcoat, through his rib, and come to rest in the muscle wall of his chest, roughly the distance of a closed fist from his heart. He has been shot for 4 minutes. He speaks for the next 80. And here is the part almost nobody tells you. When the doctors finally get him onto a table at Johns Hopkins trained hands in Chicago, they look at the x-ray, and they look at each other, and they decide to do nothing. The bullet is too close to too many things that matter. Digging it out would be more dangerous than leaving it in dot, so they leave it in. Theodore Roosevelt carries that bullet inside his body for the next 6 years, 2 months, and 23 days. It does not kill him. The Amazon does not kill him. Spanish rifles at San Juan Heights do not kill him. A leg wound that turns septic in a jungle 1,000 miles from a hospital does not kill him. What kills him is a blood clot in his sleep, in his own bed, at 4:15 in the morning. On a quiet Monday in January, the toughest president in American history dies without a fight. And when I started pulling this story apart, I found something that genuinely surprised me, because the standard version of Theodore Roosevelt, the cowboy, the rough rider, the force of nature who bent the century to his will, that version is a story about a man who chose everything. The record tells a different story. It tells the story of a man who spent 40 years standing in front of doors that opened and closed almost entirely by accident. A dead vice president he never met. A surgeon in Buffalo who couldn't find a bullet. A sentence he said out loud on the happiest night of his life, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to take back. Every single one of those doors could have swung the other way. And if even one of them had, the 20th century looks different. Start in a bedroom in New York City in the 1860s. And picture a father holding a child upright at 3 in the morning. Theodore Roosevelt is born in October 1858 into wealth, into a good name, into a house on East 20th Street with servants and books and every advantage the city can offer, and into a body that keeps trying to shut down asthma in an era with no inhaler, no epinephrine, no understanding of what asthma even is. The treatments of the day include black coffee, cigars, and being carried into the night air in a moving carriage so the speed forces air into the lungs. That is what his father does. Theodore Sr. takes his son out into the dark and drives fast, because that is the entire medical arsenal available to a rich man in 1865. The family doesn't send him to school. He is too fragile to survive a schoolroom, too fragile for the mud and the shouting and the germs. So he is taught at home, surrounded by books and dead birds, because the boy who cannot run outside becomes obsessed with the outside instead. By his teens, he is a serious amateur ornithologist. He teaches himself taxidermy. He writes field notes with the precision of a man 3 times his age. Here is the door. It is a physical door, and it is his father who opens it. The story the family tells is that Theodore Sr. looks at his wheezing 13-year-old and says, in essence, you have the mind, but you don't have the body. And without the body, the mind can't do the work. And the boy answers, I'll make my body. Whether those exact words were spoken, I can't tell you. Family memory smooths its own edges. And this is the kind of line that gets polished by retelling. But what is not in dispute is what happens next, because it's documented in receipts and photographs and other people's letters. A gymnasium is installed in the house. The boy starts lifting. He boxes. He hikes. He rows until his hands split. And it works, partly. The asthma recedes. The body thickens. By 1876 he's at Harvard, publishing on birds, and by his 20s he's genuinely, physically formidable. But I want to be careful here, because this is where the myth-making starts, and it matters for everything that comes later. Roosevelt did not cure himself. He overrode himself. There is a difference, And the difference is the whole tragedy of the last 10 years of his life. He learned, at 13, that the correct response to a failing body is to punish it into compliance. That lesson saves him at 13. It kills him at 60. Because when a man spends his youth proving that willpower beats biology, he will still be trying to prove it in a jungle at 55, with a wound that will not close and a fever of 105. His father dies in February 1878 of a stomach tumor at 46. Theodore is 19 and away at school when it happens, and he never gets over it. He calls his father the best man he ever knew. The estate leaves him roughly $60,000, an enormous sum in 1878, enough that he never has to earn a living if he doesn't want to. He's now free. He's also, for the first time in his life, without the person who told him what to become. And the very next thing he does is fall in love. Her name is Alice Hathaway Lee, and by every account that survives, Roosevelt was flattened by her. He meets her through a Harvard friend in 1878. He decides, more or less immediately, that he is going to marry her. His diaries from that period read like they were written by a man with a fever. They marry in October 1880, on his 22nd birthday. Understand what happens over the next 3 years, because it is the fastest rise in American politics that almost nobody talks about. He gets elected to the New York State Assembly in 1881. At 23, he's the youngest man in the chamber. He arrives dressed like a dandy, talks like a Harvard man, and the machine politicians of Albany look at him and laugh. They stop laughing. He goes after corruption in the state judiciary, publicly, by name, and he does it with a kind of theatrical fearlessness that nobody in that building has seen before. Within 2 years, he is a national figure in miniature, the reform kid from New York. And then comes February 1880-4. On February 12th, Alice gives birth to a daughter. They name her Alice. Roosevelt is in Albany, at work. The telegram that reaches him says, "It's a girl, mother is doing well." A second telegram arrives a few hours later. He takes the night train down to New York, through fog, so thick the trains are running late. He gets to the house on West 57th Street and climbs the stairs, and what he finds is this: his mother, Meaty, is dying downstairs of typhoid fever. His wife, Alice, is dying upstairs of what the family calls Bright's disease, kidney failure, masked 4 months by the pregnancy. His brother Elliot meets him at the door and says, "There is a curse on this house." He dies at 3 in the morning on February 14th. Alice dies that afternoon, about 11 hours later, in the same house, in her husband's arms. She's 22. Their daughter is 2 days old. In his diary that day, Roosevelt draws a large black X. Under it he writes, "The light has gone out of my life." And then he does something that people still argue about 140 years later. He hands the baby to his older sister Amy. He goes back to Albany, finishes the legislative session at a pace his colleagues describe as frightening, and then he leaves, for the Dakota Territory. He essentially deletes Alice from his own record. He does not write about her again. He does not speak her name in his autobiography. When his daughter grows up, she will say her father never once discussed her mother with her. I've seen this called cruelty. I've seen it called Victorian propriety. Here's what I think, and I want to be honest that this is interpretation other than documented fact. I think it was the only survival strategy he had. He was a man whose entire operating system, installed at age 13, was when the body fails you, override it. Grief is the body failing you. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He overrode it, and he went west, and he rode until it stopped hurting. Now, the door. Here's a correction that matters, and you will hear this wrong in almost every telling. Roosevelt did not go to North Dakota. North Dakota does not exist in 1884. It's the Dakota Territory. Statehood comes in 1889. Small thing, but it tells you how much of this story gets flattened in transit. What he does there is build a ranch, the Elkhorn, and try to become a cattleman. And here is the part that gets left out of the cowboy legend entirely. He fails, Catastrophically, the winter of 1886 into 1887 is one of the worst in the history of the northern plains. Cattlemen called it the Big Die-Up. Blizzards, then a thaw, then a freeze that sealed the grass under ice. Herds across the territory were annihilated. Roosevelt loses the majority of his cattle and a very large share of the money he had put into them. The cowboy president was, financially, a failed rancher. And if that winter had been mild, he stays. He's 30. He is rich enough. He loves it there. And he has just been publicly humiliated in New York politics. He ran for mayor of New York City in 1886 and finished third. A man with a working ranch and a bruised ego has every reason to stay west. The blizzard is what sends him home. One more thing happens in this stretch, and it's the part of Roosevelt's life that gets sanded down the most. Before Alice, there had been a childhood friend named Edith Kermit Carow, and I want to say her name correctly, because you will see it mangled constantly. Edith Kermit Carow, not Carol. She and Roosevelt had grown up in and out of each other's houses. Something broke between them in their late teens. Nobody knows exactly what. They meet again by accident, in his sister's front hall, in 1885. Roosevelt is horrified. He has publicly declared that remarriage is a betrayal. He has written it down, and then he does it anyway. They marry quietly in London in December 1886 and have 5 children together, one of whom he names Kermit, after her. Edith raises Alice. Edith runs the household, manages the money he keeps losing, and, this is documented in her own letters, quietly reads his correspondence and steers him away from his worst impulses for the next 33 years. Every version of Roosevelt you've ever seen was, to some degree, edited by Edith. And within a decade, the man she married is going to try to start a war. By 1897, Roosevelt has climbed back. Civil Service Commission, New York City Police Commissioner, and then a job that on paper is minor and in his hands is not. Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President William McKinley. He wants a war. He's not subtle about it. He believes, and this is one of the genuinely uncomfortable parts of his record, so let's not pretend otherwise, that the United States is a rising power that needs to test itself, that combat is morally clarifying, and that the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean is ripe. He spends 1897 quietly readying the fleet. Then, on the night of February 15, 1898, the battleship USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. 266 American sailors die. And here is where I have to stop the story and open a case file, because this is one of the great unresolved questions in American history, and the version you were taught in school, almost certainly too confident. Theory 1, a Spanish mine. This is the finding of the U.S. Navy's own Board of Inquiry in 1898, and again of a second official investigation in 1911, when the wreck was raised. It's the finding that put America into a war. Remember, the Maine was on the front page of every Hearst paper in the country within days. Theory 2, an internal accident. In 1976, Admiral Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, not a man given to soft conclusions, commissioned a technical re-examination and concluded that the most probable cause was spontaneous combustion in a coal bunker adjacent to a forward magazine. Bituminous coal fires were a known, recurring hazard on ships of that era. No mine, no Spain. An accident. Theory 3, open. In 1998, National Geographic commissioned a computer modeling study by a marine engineering firm, and the results did not settle it. The modeling found that an external explosion could have produced the observed damage. The report's language was that it appeared more probable than previously concluded that a mine caused the inward bent bottom structure. Other analysts have criticized that study's assumptions in turn. So, 3 investigations, 3 different degrees of confidence, spread across 100 years, and no consensus. What we can say with certainty is this: the one group with no plausible motive to blow up the Maine was Spain, which was desperately trying to avoid war with the United States, and knew exactly what an incident like this would trigger. Roosevelt did not wait for any of that. Within days, he was privately calling it an act of dirty treachery. He'd made up his mind before there was anything to make up his mind about. And then, and this is the part that tells you who he was, he quit. He resigned the second highest civilian job in the United States Navy. In the middle of the war, he had spent a year helping to arrange, because he did not want to administer it. He wanted to be shot at. He helped raise the first United States Volunteer Cavalry. The press names them the Rough Riders. On July 1st, 1898, he leads a charge up Cattle Hill, on horseback, in front of his men, wearing a blue polka dot bandana, into rifle fire, and does not get hit. That is a coin flip. That is genuinely nothing but luck. Men are dying on both sides of him. He's the most conspicuous target on that hill by an enormous margin. Mounted, shouting, a bandana streaming off his hat. And the bullets miss. If one of them doesn't miss, everything after this chapter does not happen. He comes home a national hero. And 2 months later he is elected Governor of New York, which is exactly the moment his own party decides he has to go. Here is the near miss that I think is the single most underrated fork in American political history, and it turns on the death of a man almost no one has heard of. Roosevelt becomes governor in 1899 and immediately does the thing the New York Republican machine was afraid he would do. He governs independently. He pushes a franchise tax on corporations. He makes appointments without clearing them. He's 39 years old, wildly popular, and completely uncontrollable. The man who has to deal with this is Senator Thomas Collier Platt, the boss of the New York Republican organization, a quiet, ruthless operator who ran the state through patronage and had gotten Roosevelt the nomination in the first place on the assumption that a war hero would be manageable. He was wrong, and he wants him gone. And then, in November 1899, Vice President Garrett Hobart dies of heart disease at 50-5. Sit with that for a second, because everything downstream runs through it. Hobart was 55. He was McKinley's closest political friend, genuinely close, unusually so for a president and a vice president. He was expected to be on the 1900 ticket, and he dies, and the second slot on the ticket opens up. Platt sees his opening. The vice presidency in 1900 is a political grave. It has no power, no portfolio, and no path. Send Roosevelt there and he disappears for 4 years. Roosevelt sees it too, and he does not want it. He says so repeatedly and in writing. He calls it a dead end. He wants to be governor. Then he wants to be president. And he knows the vice presidency is where ambitious men go to be forgotten. So he tries to be clever. He says, in effect, I will not campaign for it, and the only way I would ever accept is if the convention comes to me and demands it. He thinks, that's a safe bet. It isn't. Platt and the Western delegates and a wave of genuine popular enthusiasm run him over. The Philadelphia Convention nominates him for a vice president by acclamation, with, as it happens, exactly one delegate not voting for him. That delegate was Theodore Roosevelt. The one man in the country who saw where this was going was Mark Hanna, the Ohio senator and the most powerful party boss in America. And Hanna's reaction is the best line in the whole affair. He asks the men pushing Roosevelt onto the ticket whether any of them realize there's only one life between that madman and the presidency. They did not realize. Here's the what if, and it's enormous. If Garrett Hobart's heart holds, if he lives through 1900, which for a 55-year-old is not a wild ask, Roosevelt is not on that ticket. He finishes his term as governor, and Platt makes very sure he doesn't get another one. He's a war hero with no office and no machine behind him, in a party run by men who despise him. And when McKinley is shot in September 1901, the President of the United States becomes Garrett Hobart, a corporate lawyer, a business conservative, and a lie of the trusts, a man temperamentally incapable of trust busting, conservation, or the Panama Canal. No national forests, no Antiquities Act, no square deal. Theodore Roosevelt reaches the White House because the men wanted him out of the way, and a third man's heart gave out at 55. But we're not there yet, because McKinley doesn't die on September 6th. He almost lives on September 6, 1901. President William McKinley is shaking hands in a receiving line at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo when a young anarchist named Leon Cholgos steps up with a revolver wrapped in a handkerchief and fires twice. The first bullet deflects off a button and does almost nothing. The second goes into the abdomen. And for 8 days, William McKinley gets better. This is the near miss that almost nobody knows. McKinley was not immediately dying. He was talking, alert, and improving. The bulletins were optimistic to the point of celebration. His pulse was good. The country relaxed. Roosevelt, who had rushed to Buffalo, was told by the doctors that the president was out of danger, and he deliberately went off to the Adirondacks, partly to prove there was no crisis, and on September 13th he was up on Mount Marcy, the highest peak in New York State. Now consider what was wrong in Buffalo. The surgeons could not find the second bullet. They went in, they searched by hand and by light, and they closed him up without locating it. They did not have a surgeon experienced in abdominal gunshot wounds on hand at the start. The first man to operate was a gynecologist who happened to be nearby. The operating room had no electric light. At one point they reportedly used a mirror to reflect sunlight into the wound. And here is the detail that makes this genuinely painful. On the grounds of that same exposition, as an exhibit, there was an X-ray machine. Thomas Edison sent another one. It was never used on the president. What killed McKinley was gangrene along the bullet track. Tissue death the doctors could not see and, in an era before antibiotics, could not have reliably stopped even if they had. I want to be fair to those surgeons. The honest medical consensus is that an X-ray would have located the bullet, but probably would not have saved him, because the fatal problem was infection and pancreatic injury, not the bullet's position. Some historians disagree and argue that better surgical drainage could have changed the outcome, that one stays open, but sit with the shape of it. Two American presidents, 11 years apart, both with a bullet that couldn't be removed. One of them dies of it. The other one carries his around 4-6 years and dies of something else entirely. On the evening of September 13th, a park ranger climbs Mount Marcy with a telegram. Roosevelt comes down the mountain in the dark, by buckboard, through the rain, changing horses at relay stations, 40 miles to the nearest train. Somewhere on that road, before dawn, he stops being the vice president. McKinley dies at 2:15 in the morning on September 14th. Roosevelt is sworn in that afternoon in a friend's library in Buffalo, still in borrowed clothes. He's 42 years old. He's the youngest president in American history, and he still is and riding on McKinley's funeral train. Mark Hanna says the sentence that follows Roosevelt into every history book. I told William McKinley it was a mistake to nominate that wild man at Philadelphia. I asked him if he realized what would happen if he should die. Now look, that damned cowboy is president of the United States. What he does with it is, by any measure, extraordinary. He goes after the trusts, not all of them, and not as radically as the legend suggests, but he establishes the principle that the federal government can break a corporation, and that principle had not existed in practice before him. He intervenes personally in the 1902 anthracite coal strike, on the side of arbitration, which no president had done. He takes the Panama Canal, by means that were and remain legally indefensible. He sends the fleet around the world. And he does the thing I think history will remember longest. He puts roughly 230 million acres of American land under federal protection. 5 national parks, 150 national forests, 18 national monuments under the Antiquities Act, and 51 federal bird reservations, the first of which he created essentially by asking whether any law prevented him from doing it, and being told there wasn't one. He creates the United States Forest Service in 1905. The sickly boy who couldn't go outside spent 7.5 years making sure the Outside would still be there. In 1906 he mediates the end of the Russo-Japanese War at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and becomes the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And to this day, only 4 US presidents have received it. Now, the door he closed on himself. On the night of November 8, 1904, Roosevelt wins the presidency in his own right in a landslide. It is, he says later, the happiest political night of his life. And that evening, at the White House, flush with victory, he issues a statement to the press. He says the wise custom that limits a president to 2 terms regards the substance and not the form. He says that the 3.5 years he served of McKinley's term constitute his first term. And then he says the sentence, "Under no circumstances will I be a candidate for or accept another nomination." Nobody asked him to say it. There was no 22nd Amendment in 1904. That's 1951. After Franklin Roosevelt, the 2-term limit was custom, not law. He could have simply said nothing. He begins regretting it almost immediately. Within 2 years, he's telling friends privately that he wishes he hadn't. He's 50 years old in 1908, younger than most presidents are when they start, at the peak of his powers, with a program half finished and an approval that would have carried him to a 3rd term without breaking a sweat. And instead he hands the party to William Howard Taft, his Secretary of War, his friend, a man of real ability and genuinely no appetite for the job. Taft's own wife wanted the presidency more than he did. Taft wanted the Supreme Court, and would eventually get it, and would call his years as Chief Justice the happiest of his life. Roosevelt puts his entire political weight behind him. Taft wins 1908 easily. And Roosevelt, restless, 50, unemployed, goes to Africa. The Smithsonian Roosevelt African expedition leaves in March 1909 and does not come back until 1910. It is a scientific expedition, and it is also a slaughter. Roosevelt and Kermit personally take over 500 animals, and the expedition collects over 11,000 specimens in total, most of which went to the Smithsonian and are still in the collections. To modern eyes, it is genuinely hard to watch. To Roosevelt, it was field science, and the specimens he brought back did real work for American natural history for decades. Both of those things are true. Then, in October 1910, in St. Louis, he climbs into a Wright Brothers biplane flown by a pilot named Arch Hoxsey and goes up for about 4 minutes. You will see this described as the first president to fly. Small correction, and it matters. He was not president at the time. He was a private citizen who had been president. He is the first former president to fly, and the first person who had held the office to go up in an aircraft. A sitting president wouldn't fly until Franklin Roosevelt. In 1940-3. He came back to America famous, restless, and increasingly convinced that Taft was dismantling everything he'd built. And that conviction is about to break the Republican Party in half. By 1912, Roosevelt has decided that the pledge he made in 1904 doesn't count, because, in his reading, it applied to a consecutive 3rd term, and 4 years have passed. I'll be straight with you. That's a lawyer's reading of a sentence he wrote to sound unconditional. He said under no circumstances. He meant it when he said it. He didn't mean it anymore. He challenges a sitting president of his own party. He wins 9 of the 12 states that hold the new primaries. He beats Taft badly where actual voters are involved. And then he loses the nomination anyway at the Chicago Convention, because in 1912 most delegates are still chosen by state machines and the machines belong to the incumbent. So he walks out and forms the Progressive Party. When a reporter asks how he feels, he says he feels as strong as a bull moose. And the name sticks. The platform, if you actually read it, is remarkable for its time. Women's suffrage, an 8-hour day, workers' compensation, a minimum wage for women, national health insurance, direct election of senators. Much of it becomes law over the following 40 years, under other people's names. And on October 14th, 1912, in Milwaukee, he steps out of the Hotel Gilpatrick into an open car and stands up to wave. A man named John Fleming Trank, a New York saloon keeper who has been following him from state to state for weeks, steps out of the crowd and fires once from a few feet away. Roosevelt does not go down. The crowd grabs Trank and starts to beat him, and Roosevelt, and this is documented by multiple witnesses, shouts at them to stop, has the man brought to him, looks at him, and orders that he not be hurt. Then he does something extraordinarily practical. He puts his fingers to his lips and checks for blood, and he coughs deliberately into his hand. Nothing. He has hunted enough and dressed enough game to know what that means. If the bullet had gone through a lung, he would be bringing up blood. He isn't. So the lung is intact. So this is not immediately fatal. So he has time. He tells the driver to go to the auditorium. He walks on stage at the Milwaukee Auditorium, opens his overcoat, and takes out the manuscript of his speech. 50 pages, folded double, with a hole punched clean through it. Behind it in his breast pocket was a steel eyeglass case. Between them, they slowed a .38 caliber round enough that it broke his fourth rib and stopped. He holds up the ruined pages and says, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." The crowd thinks it's a joke until they see the shirt. He speaks for roughly 80 minutes. Now let me correct the version of this story that circulates, because the popular telling actually undersells the strangeness of it. The usual line is that he was bleeding profusely and pushed through anyway. He wasn't, particularly. The wound bled steadily, but it wasn't arterial. And that was precisely the point. He checked, he assessed, he made a cold clinical judgment that he had time. And then he went on. This wasn't blind machismo. It was triage, performed on himself, by himself, in the street, in under a minute, which is somehow more unnerving. At the hospital, the X-ray shows the bullet lodged against the rib. The surgeons decide that operating carries more risk than leaving it. He carries it for the rest of his life. And the open case. Did it help him? The standard assumption is that being shot won him sympathy. Look at the numbers, and I'm not sure it did. Both Taft and Wilson suspended campaigning for about 2 weeks out of respect, while Roosevelt recovered, which froze the race in place as a moment when he was behind. Roosevelt finished second, ahead of a sitting president, which no third-party candidate has done before or since. But Wilson won with a plurality, and the Republican split is the reason. The 1912 election is the one where Roosevelt hands the presidency to Woodrow Wilson, which means the man who spent 1915 through 1917 screaming that Wilson was a coward for keeping America out of the war had personally put him there. As for Trank, he told police that McKinley's ghost had appeared to him in a dream and named Roosevelt as his murderer. A letter found on him also shows he was fixated on the third-term question, that no man should have 3 terms, and that anyone who tried should be stopped. He was found insane and spent the remaining 31 years of his life in a Wisconsin state institution. He never had a visitor. He died in 1940-3. He's 55. He is just lost, and he is not well. So naturally, he goes to the Amazon. The plan starts as a lecture tour and a collecting expedition, organized in large part by a Catholic priest and Notre Dame scientist named Father John Augustine Zam. In Brazil, it turns into something else entirely. When the Brazilian government offers Roosevelt the chance to map a river that had never been surveyed, the Rio da Duvida, the River of Doubt, nobody knew where it went. Nobody knew how long it was. Nobody knew what was on it. Correct name for the record, because this is another one that gets mangled. It is the Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition, and the second name belongs to Colonel Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon, a Brazilian army officer, an engineer, an explorer of genuine stature, and a man of indigenous descent whose standing order to his men when facing hostile tribes was famously die if you must, but never kill. Rondon co-led this expedition. He's not a footnote. In Brazil, he's the reason the story is remembered. Father Zam, who organized it, turned back before the river itself. Roosevelt sung Kermit, 24, engaged to be married, and they're entirely because his mother asked him to go and watch his father. Goes down the river with them. They put in on February 27th, 1914. It goes wrong almost immediately. The river is nothing but rapids. They have to portage the heavy dugouts around waterfall after waterfall, hacking a road through the forest with axes, sometimes making a few miles in a week. They lose canoes. They run short of food. One man drowns. Another man, a comrade in Julio, murders the expedition's sergeant over a stolen tin of food and walks off into the forest. And on March 27th, the canoes get pinned against rocks in the current, and Roosevelt goes into the water to free them, and he opens his right leg against a boulder. It's not a bad wound. In New York it's a stitch and a week. On the Rio da Vida it becomes an abscess, and then a deep infection, and then it collides with a malarial attack, and his temperature goes to 105, and he starts to go in and out of coherence, reciting Coleridge over and over. To nobody. They cut the abscess open in the jungle without anesthetic, and at the worst of it, Theodore Roosevelt tells the others to leave him. He argues it in the language of arithmetic. He can't walk. He's slowing them. The food is finite, and if they carry him, everyone dies. He has, at various points on the journey, carried a lethal dose of morphine. Kermit understood exactly what his father was asking for, and Kermit's answer was that he would drag his father's body down that river if he had to, and that his father knew it, which is the only argument that would have worked, because Roosevelt could not stand the idea of Kermit dying trying to save a dead man, and so he lived. They finished the survey. The river turned out to be nearly 1,000 miles long, a real tributary system feeding the Madeira, and then the Amazon. Brazil renamed it Rio Roosevelt. It's still called that. He came out of the jungle in April 1914, having lost about 55 pounds. He was 55 years old, and he had left a quarter of himself in South America. The infection in his leg never fully resolved. It flared for the rest of his life. The malaria came back in waves. Friends who saw him at Sagamore Hill in 1915 said the difference was frightening. When a skeptical audience in New York doubted his account, he answered that he was more than willing to go back and take them along. Here's what I think, and this is the door that matters most. Every biography treats the river of doubt as an adventure with a rough patch. I think it's the moment he dies. It just takes 5 more years to finish, because look at what stacked up in this body by 1914. A bullet in the chest wall, a leg that will not stay closed, chronic malaria, and an injury nobody in America even knew about. He was blind in his left eye from a detached retina suffered in a White House sparring session around 1905 with a young military aide who hit him square. He kept it secret 4 years. It wasn't public knowledge until after he left office. The presidency of Vigor was performed at half vision, and he never once stopped to heal, because at 13 he'd learned that healing is what you do instead of winning. When the war comes, Roosevelt wants to fight in it. He's 58, blind in one eye, riddled with malaria, carrying a bullet, and he formally petitions Woodrow Wilson to let him raise a volunteer division and take it to France. Wilson refuses, and Wilson, for once, is completely right. A Rough Rider division led by a half-blind former president would have been a catastrophe in the age of the machine gun. But Roosevelt experiences the refusal as personal humiliation, and the loathing between those two men becomes one of the great hatreds in American political history. But so he sends his sons instead. All 4 of them go. Theodore Jr. and Archibald are both badly wounded in France. Kermit, the son who saved him on the river, goes and fights with the British Mesopotamia first, because he can't wait for the American army to get organized. And Quentin, the youngest, 20 years old, the family favorite, the one everyone describes as the funniest and most like his father. Quentin quits Harvard, memorizes an eye chart to get past the physical, and becomes a pursuit pilot in the 95th Aero Squadron of the United States Army Air Service. Note that name, not the Air Force, There is no Air Force in 1918. It isn't created until 1947. The Army Air Service. Small correction. But if you're going to tell a man's death correctly, you should get the uniform right. On July 14, 1918, during the Second Battle of the Marne, Quentin's near port is jumped by German fighters and shot down behind German lines near the village of Chamery. He's killed by 2 rounds to the head. He's 20 years old. The Germans, who knew immediately whose son they had, buried him with full military honors, and marked the grave with a wooden cross bound together with wire from his own aircraft. Here is the near miss that I cannot stop thinking about. The war has 120 days left to run when Quentin dies. 120. And the reason he was in that cockpit at all is that his father had spent 20 years teaching all 4 of his boys that a life without risk was not a life, that the strenuous life was the only honorable one, that the worst thing a man could be was soft. Roosevelt knew it. When the news came, he wrote publicly that it was right and honorable, and privately, to those closest to him, something else entirely. Edith said afterward that you could see the boy in him die with Quentin. He was heard, in the months after, saying the same 3 words to himself in the stable: poor Quentin, poor Quentyn. After Quentin, he goes down fast. By November 1918, he is hospitalized 4 weeks with inflammatory rheumatism and complications tied to the old jungle infection. He's nearly deaf in one ear by then, in addition to the eye. He's 59 and he looks 70. He's also, at that exact moment, the overwhelming favorite for the 1920 Republican nomination. The polls of the day and the party's own operatives were clear about it, and he was being urged from every corner to run. He tells a friend he doesn't much care about being president again, but that he would like to be able to walk without pain. On the evening of January 5, 1919, at Sagamore Hill, he works on an editorial, then tells his valet James Amos to put out the light. Those are his last recorded words. Please put out the light. Edith wakes in the early hours because his breathing has changed. By the time the doctor gets there, it's over. He died at about 4:15 in the morning on January 6, 1919. At 60 years old, his son Archibald cabled his brothers, still in uniform in Europe, 4 words: the old lion is dead. And here is the open case. What killed him? The contemporary and most widely repeated finding is a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot travelling to the lungs. That's what most reference works still say. But a substantial body of medical historical opinion argues for a coronary embolism or coronary thrombosis, a clot in the heart's own vessels, which is what several accounts closest to the family reported at the time, and what the National Park Service at Sagamore Hill describes. And there's a third line of argument that neither of the first to really address it. What made a 60-year-old man clot in the first place? Roosevelt had been immobilized for long stretches by leg inflammation. He had recurrent malaria. He had chronic infection. He had almost certainly untreated cardiovascular disease and had been living 4 years on a diet and a workload that no physician would have signed off on. Some medical writers have argued for an underlying inherited or acquired clotting predisposition. Given the family's cardiac history, there was no autopsy, so we are never getting a verdict. What we can say is this: nothing that killed Theodore Roosevelt was acute. Everything that killed him had been accumulating since a boulder in a Brazilian river, and arguably since a bedroom in Manhattan in 1860-5. Line them up, and look at what you actually have. A boy who nearly died of asthma in an era with no treatment for it. A wife and a mother dead in one house on one afternoon. A blizzard that destroyed his ranch and sent him back east. A hill in Cuba where every bullet missed. A vice president's heart failing at 55. A surgeon in Buffalo who couldn't find a bullet. A sentence spoken out loud on the happiest night of his life. A folded speech manuscript and a steel eyeglass case. A son who refused to leave him or a river. Not one of those was in his control. We look at Rushmore, and we see 4 men who chose the shape of the American century, and there is a real sense in which Roosevelt did. Nobody made him protect 230 million acres. Nobody made him take on Northern securities. Nobody made him sit 2 empires down in New Hampshire until they signed, but he only got the chair because the party bosses tried to bury him in the vice presidency, and the man they were counting on died first. The way I see it, the honest version of Theodore Roosevelt is not the story of a will that overcame everything. It's the story of a will that was pointed repeatedly by pure accident at doors that happened to be standing open, and of a man who ran through every single one of them without stopping, until the running was the only thing left, and it was killing him. And this is the part that gets me. He was, more than any president before him, the one who understood that the 20th century was going to be enormous and dangerous, and that the United States was going to be at the center of it. He built the Panama Canal and the modern Navy and the conservation system and the regulatory state on that instinct. And the century he saw coming took his son 120 days before the shooting stopped. In my view, the tragedy of Roosevelt isn't that he died at 60, it's that the one lesson he took from his father, that a failing body is an enemy to be beaten, was correct at 13 and catastrophically wrong at 55. Every one of his defining acts after 1912 was a man treating his own physical collapse as a personal failure of nerve. He didn't go to the Amazon in spite of losing an election. He went because of it. He needed to prove the machine still ran. He could not accept that a body is not an opponent. Here's what I keep coming back to. The Milwaukee speech, the one with the hole in it, was titled The Progressive Cause Greater Than Any Individual. He wrote that title before he was shot, and then a bullet went through the words greater than any individual on its way into his chest, and he stood up and read the ruined pages out loud for 80 minutes to prove the title wrong. That's the whole man, in one object. He believed the cause was bigger than any person, and he could not stop making himself the proof of it. When word reached Washington that Roosevelt had died in his sleep, the Vice President of the United States, Thomas R. Marshall, a mild, funny man who had spent years being the punchline to Roosevelt's energy, said the only thing anyone has ever needed to say about him. Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight. He's buried on a hillside in Oyster Bay, Long Island, 26 steps up from the path, one for each president, though nobody planned it that way. There is no marble, no rotunda, no eternal flame. His funeral had no eulogy. He'd asked for none. And somewhere in that grave, still, is a .38 caliber bullet that a surgeon in Chicago decided, in October 1912, it would be safer to leave exactly where it was. It outlived him. If this one hit you, hit the like button. It genuinely does help these get found, and subscribe, because we do this every week. The moments where history came within inches of going the other way. Every source for this episode is linked in the description, including the ones that disagree with each other. And if you want the other side of this story, the president who didn't survive his bullet, and the X-ray machine sitting unused a few hundred yards away, that video's on screen now. Thanks for watching.